Kara, I'm going to begin with you. Let's talk about the phone call. Vladimir Putin, there's a readout from his side of things. There's also a Truth Social post from Donald Trump about what happened on the call. Give it to us.
Yeah, Katie, it's understandable that you're reading some things twice because we're getting two readouts from both sides in this very fast, from the Trump administration and also from the Kremlin. That in and of itself tells you something. There are dueling narratives about what's happened here, and both sides think it's important to get their version out. Let's start with President Trump's version. I think the headline here, just reading what President Trump has said, and I'll read a little bit to you in a moment, is that President Trump is backing away from what he said he wanted, which was a face-to-face meeting with President Putin. He also appears to be effectively accepting what President Putin has been saying he wants, which is to negotiate directly with the Ukrainians and to be left to do that, if you like, to kind of battle it out across the deal-making table. And finally, I think from reading what President Trump has said on his Truth Social platform, he does appear to be saying that normalization with Russia, read for that, economic deals, can only happen after there is a ceasefire, after there is an end to the war. So that's interesting. I'll just read you a little bit. I just completed a 2-hour call with President Putin of Russia. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because they know details of a negotiation that nobody else will be aware of. He goes on to talk about the idea that trade, large-scale trade, would be possible if there was a ceasefire, and says there are places where that negotiation can happen. The Vatican, as represented by the Pope, has stated it would be very interested in hosting the negotiations. We are at the same time, Katie, getting a readout from the Kremlin itself, from President Putin himself, who pretty much walked out of the call and stood in front of Russian state media and talked about what happened. And that's fairly unusual. And that tells you how important the president of Russia thinks it is to say what he thinks happened. He says in his words, and his words came first, after the call, that it was 2 hours. So both presidents appear to agree on that. He says it was informative and very open. Read from that he's trying to heap some praise on President Trump, say that President Trump is a good guy, if you like. And overall, my opinion, this is President Putin speaking, very useful. He says that he thanked the President Trump for bringing back direct negotiations after they had failed in 2022. Now, what Putin says in his interview, in his words, is that they failed because of Ukraine. That's not actually true. 3 years ago, those direct talks failed because the Russians had such impossible demands. So what it tells you is that President Putin on the call was still insisting on his version of events while he was talking to President Trump. And he does talk about compromise later in his statement, but he also talks about that Russia is still committed to what he says is the basic principles, which are, and he says it again in his statement after that call, the root causes, as he puts it, of this 3-year war. When President Putin talks about root causes, what he means is that he wants Ukraine to be almost entirely neutral. It can't join NATO. That it wants Ukraine to hand over more territory than the Russians actually hold at this stage, and a number of other demands which Ukrainians will not sign up to. So here's the point. It doesn't look as if President Trump is now going to be hosting these talks or leading these talks. It looks like he wants the Ukrainians and the Russians to do it. And already the leader of Russia, President Putin, is making clear that he is going to stick to his demands.
Yeah, Julie, am I wrong? Listen, it's early. We're going to find out more about this call. But am I wrong to read into this as Donald Trump backing away from it, washing his hands of the negotiations? I mean, he kept saying on day one that he would end it. It's day 114 or something. It's still going. And by saying the Vatican wants to host this, they're going to handle it, is this him saying, I'm no longer a part of these negotiations, let them hash it out?
Yeah, it seemed while trying to save face, right? So he's kind of acknowledging that these are going to be negotiations about negotiations about negotiations, and everyone else is best positioned to do this other than me, and so let them have at it. I think it's interesting also, lead up to today's call, you had people like Margarita Simonyan, who is the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, RT, a 100% Kremlin-funded operation. She is one of Putin's favorite propagandists, and she was trolling J.D. Vance on Twitter in English. That video that you saw from Air Force Two, where he's saying there's all this trade that could happen, and we want to know if Vladimir Putin is serious, and that's what Donald Trump is going to say to him. Are you serious about these negotiations? And she basically said, JD, we thought you were a serious person. How can you not? Oh, because he said, we don't know if Vladimir Putin knows the way out of this war, if he knows how to get out of this war. And she said, yeah, he obviously knows how to get out of this war, meaning press it till the very end, till he conquers all of Ukraine. And I think that's and I wonder if the Trump administration understands this, that when Vladimir Putin talks about root causes, what he's talking about is by hook or by crook, we want what we want, which is all of Ukraine subjugated and malleable to our wishes and our demands. And either we can get that the peaceful way through peace negotiations, or we'll get it by war. Those negotiations that happened in Istanbul last week, if you recall, Russia's representatives came out of there and said, we're willing to fight forever. We fought Sweden for 21 years. We'll do that again here. That's not a party that wants to make peace. And maybe the president heard that today, but I would.
President Trump says that talks will begin immediately. Zelensky has showed up at the negotiating table. The question now, will Putin?
Things the president thinks is frankly stupid, that we should be able to move beyond the mistakes that have been made in the past, but that takes two to tango. I know the president's willing to do that, but if Russia's not willing to do that, then we're eventually just going to have to say, this is not our war, it's Joe Biden's war, it's Vladimir Putin's war, it's not our war. We're going to try to end it, but if we can't end it, we're eventually going to say, you know what, that was worth a try, but we're not doing it anymore.
All right, our panel's here, and we're also joined by CNN's Jeff Zeleny, who's live at the White House. Jeff, let me start with you on what we're learning in the wake of this phone call. How has President Trump been characterizing it, and how is that different from how the Russian president has been talking about it?
Well, Casey, as you said, President Trump is essentially giving this 2-hour phone call a glowing review. I mean, just reading this readout of the phone call, you would think that things are headed toward a ceasefire, but it also sounds like a different season. As we head into summer here now, as we head into the month of June, another month of fighting, this is exactly where the conversations were a few months ago, negotiating discussions about settlements, about going into a ceasefire discussion, rather than negotiating a ceasefire itself. So what I'm struck by, Casey, is all last week as the president traveled throughout the Middle East, as we traveled along with him, and on Friday, he said specifically, we will have to meet, Vladimir Putin, President Trump, we will have to meet, he and I will meet, and we'll solve it. But today, in the statement, the president has said that, essentially said that Russia and Ukraine will have to negotiate this out themselves. So something has changed a bit here, but the president, the U.S. president, clearly is not pressuring Putin at all. There was no sign of leverage. And the bottom line, there was also no response, as far as we can tell, about Vladimir Putin wanting to meet. Donald Trump ended last week wanting to meet face-to-face with Vladimir Putin. There was no such a discussion of that. So the bottom line is, it seems like we are a long way from even a ceasefire, let alone a sustained peace here. But look, any conversation obviously is a good conversation to have. Both parties are talking. But at the end of the day here, I'm not sure what was gained by this. There certainly were no significant breakthroughs, if any breakthroughs at all.
All right, Jeff Zeleny reporting for us. Fascinating stuff there, Jeff. Thank you very much. All right, our panel joins us now. CNN anchor, Chief National Security Analyst Jim Sciutto, CNN contributor, New York Times journalist, and podcast host Lulu Garcia-Navarro, former communications director for the DNC, Mo Alithi, and CNN political commentator and Republican strategist Brad Todd. Welcome to all of you. Thank you all for being here. Jim Sciutto, let me start with you. I was reading a little bit into how J.D. Vance was framing that there. I mean, on the one hand, the much sunnier meeting with Vladimir Zelensky, right? Of course, it was Vance who, if anyone, really torqued that Oval Office meeting and made it worse. But on the other hand, what he said there on the plane really leave the door open to them saying, this is not our war, and potentially ceasing to offer U.S. support. What did you hear in it?
So, I heard quite the same thing, and it's interesting because I spoke to a senior European diplomat, and I said, what are your takeaways from this call? And the first one was, it looks like the U.S. is stepping back from the talks, making it clear this is between Russia and Ukraine, and it's really not our game. The second piece is that this diplomat was disappointed that President Trump did not bring up U.S. sanctions on Russia, because the obvious point here is that Russia still has not agreed to a ceasefire that Ukraine agreed to weeks ago and that the president demanded weeks ago. And hanging over this had always been the threat that the U.S. would apply a stick of sanctions. But even with another call where you didn't get that deliverable, still no threat of sanctions. And really the message seems to be, I'm going to let them duke it out, right? That kind of thing, which is, from the European perspective, it's a disappointment, right? Because they do want to push these forward, and the administration position seems to be stepping back.
I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could just say, I'm not going to do anything about this, and it would all go away? But that's not what's happened. We see that in Gaza. I mean, the war there is expanding. There was a promise that there was going to be a ceasefire under Donald Trump. He said it was really important to end that war, and now that war is again expanding.
See that this is absolutely despicable behavior from the Trump-Vance team. And this is what Russia wants you to see, because they know that a divided America on this issue serves their interests. When this conflict first broke out and Trump was really marginalized, remember, like Trump was out of the White House, and that was during one of that moment where it looked like I knew he was going to run again. I knew that. I knew before a lot of people, they thought he was done. I'm like, no, unless he's in prison or no longer with us on this planet, he was running again for president. And maybe even if in prison as well. But there were moments where they looked like maybe DeSantis had some momentum right after the midterms, all of that, blah, blah, blah. There were moments where MAGA didn't have much of a voice even on Russia-Ukraine. And there was a broad, not total, but broad bipartisan unification on opposing Russia and helping Ukraine in Congress. There were MAGAs, but they did not control the majority of the GOP even on the issue. And in the Senate especially, the Republicans and Democrats were almost entirely united, right? Talking like 85, 90 senators at least, right? And so at that moment, that was bad for Putin. When Western allies of Ukraine are united internally, it's bad. And so what does he want? He wants Republicans to make this a culture war issue domestically. Somehow it's woke to support Ukraine or whatnot. And have his crony J.D. Vance go out and say, well, this isn't our war, it's Biden's war. And when, of course, it's not Trump's war or Biden's war. It's Putin's war. And the United States has a role to play in stemming the tide, as do the rest of the NATO countries. But it's not Putin. It's no U.S. president caused this war. If anything, Putin did this war in part, I feel, because he knew that Trump could win again, and he gambled. And say what you will, he's a good gambler. That's what happened here. But Putin wants Americans fighting domestically on this issue so they're not united on the global stage.